An alternate to direct seeding your plants is to use transplants. Transplants that you can purchase at local nursery centers are a great way to save time because essentially you're buying a plant that has lived in a nursery for up to a month. Another advantage of working with transplants is you don't have to deal with the constant watering involved with direct seeded crops and keeping the soil moist all the time. And the plants are already established, so they'll do better and defending themselves against pests like slugs, snails, and birds. There's also the sense of instant gratification of putting a transplant in the garden. When selecting transplants in the nursery, you want to pick a plant that's not too young or not too old. Feel free to pull out the transplant from the container that it's in and see that the roots hold the soil material together and that they're not all bound and knotted or growing over one another on the bottom. Another thing to think about when purchasing transplants, if the plant has begun to flower or make fruit, those are something that you'll want to remove from your transplant after you plant it, because you want the plant to invest its energy into growing root structure and plant structure before the plant takes on the labor-intensive process of making fruit. Before setting out to transplant with students, you or your students need to know the appropriate or suggested spacing of the plants that you're planting. You can usually find this information on a plant label. You can find it in garden guides or online. These kale plants right here, the label tells me they should be planted 8 to 12 inches apart. To find these measurements, you can use lots of different ways. One way we can always have a ruler present with us in the garden is to measure your hands before you go out and garden. So here, my hand from finger to thumb is my 9-inch ruler, and when I measure my knuckle to knuckle fist, that's my 4-inch ruler. I always have this ruler with me. Other ways to estimate spacing is to know how long your trowel is. Some trowels even come marked with inches on them, but I know that this trowel is about 10 inches because my hand ruler here is about 9 inches. So using this as a guide to spacing or any other mechanism you come up for spacing is something to know before you go out and transplant. Transplanting is a relatively easy and successful task that kids could take on themselves. There's a few things to think about when transplanting with kids. One, you want to be careful when you remove the plant to not disturb or break the main stem. So if kids are removing their own transplants, they want to squeeze the container to gently remove the transplant from the container. Once they have their transplant, they're going to place it or dig a hole, and they want the level of the top of the transplant to be even with the level of the soil in the garden bed. And that's about it. We're often asked if you need to tease or loosen up the roots on the bottom of the transplant. Well, that depends on the transplant that you have. This transplant does not have a lot of roots that are bound together, so you wouldn't need to tease this one or loosen up the roots. But some root-bound transplants that you might get might need a little bit of loosening up of the root material before the transplant is set in the ground. And that would just be kind of loosening up the roots like this a little bit to get them untangled if they're all root-bound. All right, class, have you ever had kale salad? Yeah, we pick lots of leaves to make kale salad. Today we're gonna plant enough plants so that we can make a kale salad in a few weeks. We're gonna plant 12 plants and we're gonna start with this 6-pack right here. So I'm gonna first show you how to do a transplant. When you hold the plant, you wanna be careful not to break any of the leaves, or especially don't break this stem right here. So hold the plant gently, and once you pick up your plant, you're gonna dig a hole and you're gonna put your plant in the ground so that the level of the top of this soil ball is the same level as the top of the garden bed soil. You're gonna put your plant in there. You can gently put a little pressure around the plant to make sure the root is connected to the soil and there's no air space. And so that's all you're gonna do. You're gonna use a trowel. So now that you have your trowels, I'm gonna lay out the plants, and when I say go, you're gonna come and find a plant and you're gonna plant it right where you find it on the garden bed. So I'm putting these out just where they need to be, and your job will be to plant the plant where you find it. Okay, Sean, come on up here. Here's your trowel. I want you to plant one of those plants. Sienna, you're gonna come up next and you're gonna plant the next one. All right, and Jorge, you're gonna do the third plant. Good job, high five. I have found the most success in setting up transplanting with kids by doing the method that I showed previously, by laying the plants out at the appropriate spacing and inviting the kids to come and transplant. If you have more time, or if you have older kids that have the ability and the organizational skills to set up their own spacing, there are lots of ways you can do that. One way is by bringing out yardsticks or measuring tapes and having them lay them down and setting up the spacing using some sort of marker. For example, these labels could be set out every 12 inches. And then after they've marked up their space for planting, kids could replace the markers with a transplant. In place of using labels, I've also seen garden educators set up their spacing, or having their kids set up their spacing using a ruler and marking the spaces with trowels. And in that scenario, the kids would bring a transplant to a trowel and replace the trowel space with the transplant. Alternatively, drip irrigation lines could be used as spacing tools as well. This drip irrigation system has emitters every 6 inches, and you can have your students do the math to figure out how they would get a 12-inch spacing when the emitters are at every 6 inch. So for example, students would know to mark every other emitter of the irrigation line is 12 inches. All right, class, so we're gonna plant some transplants. As you can see, I put trowels right in the ground. And what I want you to do is you're gonna carefully grab your plant and you are going to bring it to where a trowel is, remove the trowel, and you're gonna put the plant right where the trowel is. These trowels have been spaced out already at 12 inches apart, and that's how we want our plants to get planted. Okay guys, ready? Okay, Henry, you're gonna grab the first plant and bring it in, take it out carefully, and find a trowel. If you have a need for kids to handle transplants individually, we have found success by cutting up the 6-pack and making a 1-pack, and then slicing the 1-pack down the edge so the kids could more easily remove the transplant. Sun, soil, water, air, and care. Now that our transplants are in the ground, we need to water them in. So as an adult, what I would do is I would use a big watering can, like one of these, and the initial watering in, what your goal to do is to soak all around the root ball. If the area you're watering starts to flood, you want to pull back a little bit and then add water once the water soaks in. Depending on your soil type, usually you need to give about 3 to 5 drinks to soak in the area around the plant root. I gave this plant 4 sips or little doses of water. Now that I've given the plant the water, I want to make sure that the water has soaked in below the level of the roots, and I can do that by sticking my finger in there. Ooh, and I can feel that it's wet and gushy down there, which is good for this plant. Then I could go and water the next plant, giving it 3 to 4 little sips, letting the water soak in so that it doesn't run away from the plant. Once again, watering is a slow process. You can also see why it would be advantageous when kids make those little moats around each little plant. It allows you to add a little bit more water without having the water run away from the base of the plant. As you can see, filling small watering containers with the end of the hose isn't usually the most successful, nor can a lot of kids get involved at one time. We like to use a dipping bucket, which is any type of vessel that can hold a large amount of water. You can have all your watering containers just living there, and the kids can come, dip, water, and return. You're practicing inefficiency by design, and you're adding physical activity if kids have to run back and forth to get their third glass of water. These dipping containers can also work for larger watering containers such as a watering can. It'd be a great early finisher project or anytime task to do while you're in the garden. All right, our plants are in the ground. We successfully transplanted them. We've got sun, soil, water, and air. The last thing is care. How can we protect these baby plants from birds and other pests or predators that might come and eat them? We want to cover up our plants to protect these babies. In this garden bed, we have two different styles that I'm demonstrating here. You can use this rolled steel and make a little arch, or you can use a PVC pipe and bend a hoop. And these are structures that can hold a material like this, which we call floating row cover or remay, and we can put this over our garden bed. Come on, Sean, let's cover up our plants so that birds don't eat it. And once we get the cover over our garden bed, you can use something like a piece of wood. I've seen people use rocks. I've even seen people use handfuls of soil to pin the floating row cover or protective material and create a hoop to protect their plants. This bed was designed to have these sleeves or collars to put your arch material or hoop material in. They're just PVC pipes that are a little bit wider that have been drilled into the side of the bed. Floating row cover or remay doesn't actually need to be on a hoop. It is designed to float or lay on top of the baby plants, and as the plants grow up, they lift the remay up. Remay is also designed to let a certain amount of air, light, and water go through it as well. An alternative to using floating row cover or remay is to use a netting product. This actually looks a lot nicer in your garden space. It doesn't create extra heat, but this will not protect from flying insects. It does protect from birds, squirrels, and bunnies. One thing to note, we actually use a fencing product. This is a 7-foot deer fencing that we got at Tractor Supply Company. It's much more sturdier and lasts much longer than the bird netting product that you'll find in garden companies. So look for a fencing product that has holes that are smaller than an inch, and that will help protect your garden beds from birds and critters like small mammals. And it looks much nicer than floating row cover or remay.